Everyone can relate to grief of losing a loved one. But grief of losing your homeland, you don't realize how much you've lost until you stop and think about it.
Es como destruir nuestro corazón.
It's like we're all implicated by admitting that the way we live is causing a catastrophe.
If this land hurts, we hurt.
La destrucción de la Madre Tierra es nuestra destrucción.
This culture is so unbelievably fucked.
It's time for revolution.
The thing with climate change, it's not like there's been one death and then we grieve it. This is continuous.
We need to tell the truth. We can't hide things just because it's not hopeful.
Out the way! Will my grandchildren's eyes still be able to see what I see?
Estamos en un punto muy crítico.
There are dire warnings that New South Wales will be hit by increasingly extreme weather.
2015 was the hottest year since climate records began.
Figures show this July was the single hottest month in recorded history.
Australia sweltered through its hottest spring on record.
Climate change is now affecting every country on every continent.
It's the rate that's of great concern.
And what do you put that rate down to?
Oh, it's human activity.
We have everything we need. Some still doubt that we have the will to act, but I say the will to act is itself a renewable resource.
When I talk to people about this, they always say we need to have hope, otherwise we won't do anything. And we can't just tell these negative stories, and we need to tell the positive stories. No, we need to tell the truth. We can't hide things just because it's not hopeful. It's like people, they can't do anything without hope.
I used to think hope was a belief in the possibility of a better, even a beautiful future. But I've learned that kind of hope is no friend of mine. It distracts me from what's right in front of me and blinds me from what is heading in my direction. So now I understand hope is found in this moment. What I choose to do now, that is all I have. What we each have.
Hello and welcome to Climactic. It's Mark Spencer here, publisher of the Climactic Collective, and I'm doing another one-take intro to today's episode. What you've just been listening to for the last couple minutes has been a couple moments from the film The Magnitude of All Things. This is a documentary film that was released in 2020 and is now available in a few festivals, film festivals, happening around the world. That includes New Zealand's own Doc Edge Film Festival, where it's available for online viewing. And today's episode is originally going to be episode of Artbreaker, which is the show on the Climactic Collective that takes a look at the art we make in response to and in engagement with the climate crisis. It's still going to be that, but the version I have for you today, here on the Climactic feed and also on the Climactic Candid feed, is the full length, or the more full version of a conversation with the director of that film and also the composer of the film. The Magnitude of All Things is a gorgeous, cinematic look at the grief we feel when confronting the climate crisis, and also a conversation about hope. What does real hope look like in the face of this monumental, staggering, horrifying, overwhelming thing that is the climate crisis? And how might we learn some lessons from cancer and the process that many of us have seen loved ones go through, or that ourselves have experienced when facing a cancer diagnosis. In many ways, our planet has a cancer diagnosis, and sadly, that cancer isn't a unthinking, uncaring malignancy in our genes, but it is us. It is the caring, mostly, thinking, conscious us, the plurality of our species. It's an amazing film, and this is, without being overwrought, it's the best conversation I've had in the space of the climate community. Jen and Rob were so generous in what they engaged with me about, generous in their giving of advice to future filmmakers and composers in how to make climate-engaged art, and I can't wait to bring the Artbreaker version of this episode to you. But please don't let that distract from or take away from this version you're about to hear. And yes, this is a long episode, but it truly is worth it. You will hear some natural accompaniment to the episode, and when it gets made into an Artbreaker episode, you'll hear a lot more of Rob's score, you'll hear more of the film than you've heard at the little intro. But this natural accompaniment is actually natural. This is Birdsong from Jen's home. It's being picked up perfectly on her laptop mic. Here's what it sounds like right now. Listen out for that in the course of the episode. Focus on that if it's getting heavy, and I look forward to seeing you on the other side. And back here again on Climactic for more climate-engaged episodes coming to you very soon. All right, let's get started.
It's our pleasure. I was just saying I was so looking forward to talking with Rob about this. We've not had the opportunity to debrief or living on different continents. Well, it's a lot easier to describe now that the film is made than before. Because ultimately, you know, the magnitude of all things tells two parallel narratives. One story is that of my sister coming to terms with her own mortality and ultimately her death, and my grief about that. And then the other narrative is really the story of our species very generally, and the way that we are dealing with the magnitude of the climate crisis on an emotional level. So the psychological and emotional dimensions of the climate crisis.
Jen and I connected over email, I think maybe around the time that I'd written an article about climate grief in The Guardian in Australia, and I'd found out from a friend through that article that Jen was making this film, and I thought, fantastic, and I'm a composer for film and TV, so I just wrote to her and shamelessly plugged my stuff at the same time as introducing and being interested in the film itself. And then from there, I think Jen and I just started, chatting and sending each other music and what she was thinking about the film, and then it kind of evolved from there that we started working together.
So you reached out to Jennifer about the film, but how did you hear about the film after writing the article in The Guardian?
Yeah, well, a friend of mine who had read the article mentioned that she'd actually met Jen as she was filming in Australia, because she'd also written something about climate grief many years earlier. That's how I sort of came in touch with this friend. So, all these connections coming through this topic. And then I think, she passed me on Jen's email. I got in touch. Jen was back in Canada, and she was, I think post-filming at that stage. So it was just, good timing, I suppose, to make that connection.
Coincidentally, a few people also had sent me your article.
Right.
Right. So it was this confluence of events, I think, that brought us together.
I think confluence is a word that runs through this whole production. It was so great to see so many Australian characters, not of course, characters like they're not real people, but, individual people from Australia in your film. And I say not characters because I happen to know a large number of them, which took me completely by surprise, because the figures you have in the film, if I didn't know any of them, they would all seem to me like members of the pantheon of climate engaged, like climate leadership. Of course, Greta and people on the negative or skeptical side of climate change like to denigrate Greta as, Saint Greta, as this, second coming of Joan of Arc, all us, following some child like saint savior figure. And I definitely would be more prone to that. Not that I would be completely, but I'd be more prone to it if it wasn't also Greta along with my friend Joe, my friend Beth. And it's just, for me, it's an amazing film at just showing that all these people that we hear a lot about in climate change are themselves just people getting by and getting along. And one really striking thing, sorry, I'll get to a question, Jennifer, is like the decision to not put in a lot of marches and strikes and protests and people talking into bullhorns. Was that a kind of a conscious decision on your part to show these people who are quite well known for climate action as sort of individuals and in quiet moments rather than in the middle of the action?
Yeah, it is a conscious decision. So two things there, I'd say. One is that it was very important for me to actually go to the front lines of some climate crises. Obviously, you can't go everywhere because there's so many. But I really wanted to profile unheard voices or frequently marginalized and disenfranchised voices on the climate front lines. The people who are bearing so much of the suffering of the climate crisis already, who frequently, as we all know, contributed to it very little. So it was very important to me to go and ask those people how they are feeling, right? And that is a question which is actually quite unusual for them to hear. And so that's really what I wanted to do. And that's a very different kind of approach, obviously, than, profiling the Bill McGibbons or those, the other climate leaders. It's not as if I don't respect them greatly, but really, in a feature documentary, you have quite a short period of time. And every frame, every fraction of a frame I pay attention to, and it needs to serve a purpose. And when you're making a film about this unique perspective, or at the time that I started the film, it was fairly unique in that most people really didn't know what ecological grief was. Now it's certainly more in the public discourse. But, so Greta, for example, she's obviously one of the highest profile climate leaders ever, but she very publicly discusses her depression and her ecological grief. So she's a very, she was somebody that I gravitated to immediately. But others are people that are not as well known, but who had the courage to speak openly and with honesty and intimacy about how they were feeling. And those emotions range from grief to anger, to despair, to hope, and displays of extraordinary resilience. So,
let me know if this is too reductive or if this is wrong, but like most climate engaged media is about what climate change is, and it's about what to do about it. And as you said, this film is much more about how people feel and how they're engaging with climate change. So is that kind of a fair kind of point of difference to draw between this film and a lot of other work in the space where those are about what and why? That's what I should have said before, is the why of why is climate change happening and what to do about it. This is much more how do you feel?
Yes, I think that's accurate, except I would sort of temper it slightly, because I reached the conclusion independently and then had that conclusion reinforced by people whose discipline this actually is, that the reason that we haven't made substantive progress on the climate front is because we have really, in many ways, struggled to come to terms with it. So, there's obviously the overt deniers, and that's one form of denial, but there's another form of denial, which, it's just such a difficult wicked problem to wrap your heart and mind around. The scale and violence of the climate crisis, the actual end of the world as we know it. I'm not saying the world will end, but as we know it, that is ending. So it's just such a difficult thing to come to terms with, that I would say that is partially to blame for our ineptitude in actually tackling the crisis. That, in addition to all of the vested interests and corporate interests that are tied to the fossil fuel industry and to polluting and to carbon emissions. So, while it definitely, the magnitude of all things is not about what and why, I do believe it contributes to what we do to solve the crisis, because the first step in solving the crisis is actually turning towards it, admitting it, coming to terms with the scale and the violence. In Canada, feature documentaries take a long time to raise the money, if you're successful at raising the money at all. So, I had the idea for the film, I believe it was about 8 years prior to actually finishing the film. And a lot of that time was spent fundraising with my co-producers, Andrew Williamson and Henrik Myers, and the NFB came on board pretty early with Shirley Bear-Cruze as our producer there. But I sort of got absconded because I'm one of the filmmakers behind the film The Corporation that came out in 2003. And I was in the midst of making Magnitude, and then this idea of doing a sequel to The Corporation arose, which I at first was very much against. But then I got absconded onto it. And so really Magnitude was interrupted. And its production schedule got pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed because we were making the new Corporation. But our filming schedule was really from January till May 2019. And in that time, we burnt a lot of carbon, but, and I know that. But I consciously decided that was for the greater good, hopefully ultimately resulting in less carbon, but it's always a dilemma. So from January to May, we visited 10 climate frontlines, 4 continents. We were in Queensland with literal monsoon rains when Townsville was flooded right at that time, and just right after, and then that's when we did our Australia trip. I actually did 2 Australia trips because I did a research trip to Australia. But from Australia, we went to Nunatsiavut, which was minus 35 degrees, so sort of plus 40 to minus 35. And anyway, we were hopping all over the place. And it's a good thing too, because we actually did finish filming before the pandemic hit. And so I was in post-production, and Rob and I were working on the music. We started working on the music really early on, but the pandemic sort of hit after we started filming. So really COVID didn't impact production or post-production that much, other than, obviously, on online editing, we were social distanced, or I was on Salt Spring Island just editing alone, and it didn't matter because Rob and I, we weren't about to get together anyway, with Rob being in Australia, although that would have been really nice. But what COVID did impact greatly has been the release, obviously.
I think the process sort of began where I might have sent Jen a bunch of music that I'd already made, but she also had made this sort of curated Spotify playlist, music that she'd been listening to in the context of this film. And that was one of the nice things about working with Jen, because, sometimes you can be working with a director where you've got very different musical aesthetics and you're like, I don't know how this is going to work. But everything Jen was sending me, I was really loving. So that was a really good start. But I think from there, that allowed the kind of aesthetic of the music to kind of narrow down a little bit, because it's quite a bit overwhelming when you first start making a film. Kind of landing on what sort of instruments and things can take a long time. But I think we started around September, and then really sort of the chunk of the work was during that sort of black summer period for me. And I think that was the kind of the weird experience about making this was that it's, outside my window, it was very smoky and I was, coughing a lot because there was just so much smoke in the air. We were well away from the fires, but everyone in Southeast Australia was experiencing the same levels of air pollution. So that real ominous feeling sort of was sitting there during the making of the music.
Can you hear that in the music you made during that time?
It's sort of hard to extract that from my own experiences of climate grief and climate change, because it's something that I've also worked on for many, many years. And I think it was just a kind of, it was kind of nice in a way, in a strange kind of way, to have that there, because it was really bringing it home and bringing it into the forefront. And that kind of allowed the, everything to rise up to the surface, which is what you kind of want as a musician, to be feeling these things pretty raw, I suppose.
So what was it like, the contrast of scoring the footage from a familiar looking, like a similar kind of place to your own home in Castlemaine, or just outside of Castlemaine, to say, Joe's story in Tathra and Bega, compared to, say, composing for the footage of the Amazon?
Part of the process of the film was I actually composed a lot of music before even seeing any of the edits. So I think, that process can be different every time you do a film, but I think probably the way that Jen and I were working was just sort of creating lots of music and sort of getting, comments back from Jen about, what she liked and didn't like, or what would work and what wouldn't work. So I was quite a way into it before I think I saw the first cut that Jen had sent me. And then over time we sort of shape that up as the edit gets more and more finalised. So I think the scenery, I don't think that was too much of an issue, but it is interesting when you're working on a film that has landscapes and scenes from across the world in so many different places, because it does shape the instruments you end up choosing and the textures and the sounds in subtle ways. And I think, listening back to it now, it wasn't a conscious decision at the time, but there are lots of different elements that are kind of seeped in that kind of, I think, are slightly representative of these different regions in the world, without being too overt and without being, we didn't put panpipes from the Amazon, for example, but there's things that the Amazon and the Greenland area sort of brings into it that I think was quite interesting to reflect on.
Was that a specific discussion saying no panpipes?
Yeah, I think Jen might have mentioned that at one point, which was fine because, right on where I was at too. But I think it's just that fine line that you tread where you're trying to, make something that sounds sonically appropriate without it being, too sort of contrived. Or thinking back on it, there's things like there's a lot of this sort of almost Nordic strings, or strings that are slightly off pitch, which I really like. You hear this a lot in a lot of these sort of Nordic noir films like The Bridge and that, but there's also a lot of it in Australian sort of early colonial music and Canadian music as well, where there's, Warren Ellis does a lot of it, and Nick Cave. And I think that kind of, for me, thinking back on that, it has a sort of homesick element to it. And I think part of it, why it worked in this film perhaps, was that sort of, loss of home and loss of place, that what they might call solastalgia is a word for it, I think. But that's sort of interesting to reflect back on how these different textures sort of came in and how they relate.
Was it a bigger driver then, rather than the locality that was being shown and the scenery, like you said? Was it instead a bigger driver to the choice of the music and the actual scoring of the music, that it matches the human emotion and the story that's being told, rather than the scenery that's being showed?
I think this is another fine line that, you got to tread carefully as a composer is you want to hold those emotions in the space and kind of carry them through scenes, but you don't want to be too manipulative. You don't want to be kind of too forceful with those. And I think Jen and I talked about that very early on. And Jen shaped a lot of the instrumentation in this, I think, just by, sort of talking through ideas about the sort of elements she wanted. There was sort of probably, I think you were thinking something around the female voice being quite dominant throughout, which it is. And then there's also a lot of body percussion and sort of, organic sort of sounds like that, where relating back, I suppose, to that sense of I don't know, people power or whatever you want to call that. But it's sort of this, there's a lot of that kind of, organic sort of percussion-y things happening throughout as well.
It's funny that choice of word, if I could just quickly say that, like, saying people power as in, like, powered by a person, it was very much getting away from the systems and the organizing and, like, the mass mobilization stuff, but instead, like, the personal, like, the actual, like, these are sounds you can make by yourself out in the woods kind of thing, and I thought that was really beautiful. That's
a nice way to think about it. I think, the sound of one hand clapping, and then you've got layers of the same person clapping, and all of a sudden it becomes more powerful than it was. It's a nice sort of, metaphor there. But
all I have to do is find a cave with a good echo, and you can do it too.
Well, because I edited the film and sound designed the film, so I'm, really hands-on in working with Rob's music. And we had all those discussions Rob's referenced. In addition, I would say, for me, in terms of sound design, I also was trying to give the earth a voice. And so I think that's there in the music, and I think also in the sound design, if you like some of this, which are, there's, if you look at if you listen carefully, the sound design draws on sound effects from horror films, because in some ways this is a horror film. But it also sort of has these deep guttural sounds, which I place, like, for example, during the kapok tree, which is a sacred tree in the Amazon. But so for me, that, that's very much part of the sound design, and Rob's music and those organic sounds within many of the tracks just, to me, work so well in this fluid way together to give. And people have commented on that. A few people have said, yeah, the earth has a voice here. And that's really gratifying for me, for people that have got that from the film.
Until you said it, I didn't realize it. I have got it in my notes here to ask about some of the elements to the instrumentation. I definitely picked up on the human element I was going to ask about. I definitely picked up on human breathing quite a bit and some hand claps. But I was going to ask about the wind chimes. I didn't think about wind chimes as the voice of nature, as the voice of the wind.
Wind chimes for me as memory takes us back. But there are, for example, dragon wings is a sound effect that's used quite a lot in the film, and yet there are no dragons. I'm a big fan of non-diegetic sound. But if you were to look at the actual descriptions of all the sound effects, it would be quite funny.
But you get that cut, the subtitled SFX. You
kept that secret
cut.
From me.
Yeah. Yeah. I that was one of the, reasons that I loved working with Rob so much, was I just feel there's quite a lot of unusual elements in the music and the sound design generally, like those organic elements, this melancholy feel, this sort of, it feels in many ways to me a very internal experience. Like, I also love pulling down all diegetic sound and then amping up sort of internal sounds like heartbeats and breath, that Rob was willing to, and actually not only that, very often initiated ideas that totally worked with that approach.
There was also an instrument called an imbira as well, which was used a lot in the memory sequences or the flashback sequences, whatever you call that, those sorts of moments in the film. I think I got it here actually, but it's just that sort of sound. A neighbour across the paddock from where I live actually made that for me. Those sorts of things, when you kind of bring them in and then mix them with other types of instruments, and then they find a little, place of their own. They kind of start to get attached to certain characters without you kind of being too conscious about it, without it being a motif or anything. But I think it's there were sort of lots of other elements that came in, like the Ron Rocco, which is my favourite instrument. It seems to turn up everywhere in everything that I do. It's an Argentinian stringed instrument and works really well across everything.
This is your second appearance on a Climactic show and the second mention of the Ron Rocco.
Second mention of a Ron Rocco, yes. And I think I need to be buried with it. But lots of strings, as I mentioned, lots of female voice from some friends that live locally, Felicity and Emily. Piano, this first time I actually scored something for piano, which was really hard because I don't normally I would make everything myself and record everything myself. I'm not very good at piano, so I sort of had to reach out to Luke Howard, who's an amazing pianist in Australia, and he was amazing. I sent him a score and he turned it around in half a day, basically, just sent it straight back to me. So I should have made it harder, but no, it was great. And that sort of, the learning curve as well.
That instrument there, that's played with your thumbs?
Yeah, it's a thumb piano, some people will call it, in West African.
And as soon as you started to play it, the images where does that, and also that's sort of Saley's instrument.
So for the real layperson, the way we've seen this in where we're used to it in pop culture, for other Star Wars nerds like myself, the idea of characters having scores, and when they're on screen, there is their score, their theme playing, so that this current bit of the film is related to that character. This is the type of film that spoke to that quite well, because you had after the initial act, and you met all your cast of characters. They then proceeded to be interwoven and pop back up over the rest of the course of the film. I didn't notice if that was an element, so it must have been either too subtle or I only watched the film once so far. But was there that kind of scoring for individual people beyond Saley?
Looking back on it, it happened, and I don't think it was conscious. But things like I think Jen pointed out, there's like a Greta's theme. There was a sort of melody there that associated with Greta that ended up sort of morphing and being a variant in a lot of other melodies throughout the film for other people. So there was sort of moments, I think, that you could look back and analyse it if you were going to do that. But I think for me, it's much more intuitive and not a conscious thing that you go about doing. But even though I love when composers do that, like I'm a big fan of Twin Peaks and Angelo Badalamenti, and that's a classic example of where those motifs are attached to characters. But
question for filmmakers and composers: would you recommend that, or would you not dissuade people preemptively from that approach if they're making a film?
Look, I think a lot of composers I know write music on score as well, and I don't do that. And I think that's the difference. If you're someone that writes things out, it's a much more sort of intellectual exercise to begin with, I think, where you can make those decisions. But for me, it's just I sit down with instruments and play and see what happens. So it doesn't really work for me to do it that way. And I actually get a bit freaked out if a director sort of asks me outright to create, motifs for this character and that character. I feel a bit confronting, but.
That's cool, seeing how the sausage gets made. Jennifer, have you ever asked for that in a film before, that kind of per character score?
No, I don't think my process is that deliberate. I'm very hands-on and experimental, and also, I really trust my gut, and I just, like Rob was saying, I just try things, and then try them over and over again in a way that would probably drive most people completely crazy, but that's the joy of working mostly alone. I can only drive myself crazy. I just refine and refine and refine and whittle and whittle and whittle and experiment and experiment and experiment until it works for me, and I really deeply, deeply trust my response to things, and so it's not premeditated. Some things obviously are premeditated, but the actual sort of decisions around what music or what images, that's really a process of experimentation.
You're choosing the next brick based on the bricks that are already there and assembled, and I guess there's a lot of metaphor you could use, but I really like that idea of you're whittling away rather than you're kind of like an architect and designing it all before anything is placed.
Well, I think that's the nature of most documentary films. They're written in the edit suite. I always like to refer to the corporation. I co-directed that film, but I also edited it from 400 hours of footage. So when I say whittling, I'm talking about, okay, the first rough cut was literally 34 hours based on 700 pages of transcripts, which I then literally for a year whittled until I found the narrative structure.
Maybe ice carving an iceberg is a better metaphor. Maybe
we've got an expression here in New Zealand of bush bashing. And then you get down to the whittling once all the foliage is cleared away. Oh, man. So from 8 years to the film being finished, when you had decided on making the film, what was kind of the state of climate-engaged filmmaking at that point? Like, who were you looking at as a example of who was doing good in this space, good filmmaking? The film is definitely described and really, I think, embodies a cinematic approach to climate change that I hadn't yet seen before. It's really a gorgeous, gorgeous film. So was there anyone in this space kind of doing work at that level before you started?
I would say that I really felt there was, in terms of climate change films, most really were trying to, one, wake people up to the catastrophe, and two, leave them with a sense that there was still hope despite this extraordinary catastrophe, right? And so, to activate people. And definitely the latter is one of my goals. But I really sensed, I think my film is in many ways a response to the pressure to be hopeful. Mm-hmm. And that I saw this as a flaw. That actually it felt to me to be a tremendous relief to actually just surrender to the truth. And so instead of succumbing to this pressure of needing to present the climate catastrophe in some sort of light that it could be managed, or that, things are going to be okay, I just really wanted people to have permission to feel deeply the crises, the catastrophe, the magnitude of what it is we're facing. So for me, there were no films doing that, which isn't to say I wasn't inspired by other people making climate change related films, but I think mine is very different in terms of its exploration of hope in a more nuanced way. Like, I'm not saying don't have hope, and especially, don't give up your hope if you have it. I'm just saying, if we have hope, let's make that authentic, as opposed to a form of denial in and of itself. So I think, just to wrap this up, it's really that I recognized the relief and the catharsis that comes from surrendering to the truth. And I wasn't going to succumb to the pressure, to be hopeful, because that's what a documentary is supposed to be. Surprisingly, though, many people post-watching Magnitude find it hopeful and find it cathartic in a strange sort of way. And I think it really is just because it is so much energy to push the truth away. And people are doing that at varying degrees. And I have amazing compassion for people that are doing that. I'm doing that myself just to cope sometimes, of course. I mean, the scale and violence, as I've said before, is just so difficult to come to terms with. But it is a tremendous relief to put that pushing away down and to just find the strength and courage to look towards what is coming in our direction. So I think that is, if I'm going to summarize, sort of what I was trying to do with this film that is different from any other climate film, at least that I've seen.
It's wonderful. Rob, you already said the magic word, one of the words I was going to ask. The title of the film being The Magnitude of All Things. Question for both of you. Could the title of this film have been Solastalgia or Psychoterratica, or another word I'm not even familiar with that kind of says what the film is about, using one of these new words that otherwise we didn't have before realizing what the climate crisis is?
I think the title's perfect because it's, it's accessible, but it's also, it really just, it sums up that complexity. Like, there are the things that Jen mentioned. Hope's very complicated, and Jen mentioned, that a lot of people found it cathartic, and I most definitely did. And I think for me, it felt a bit like a funnel, because I kind of thought I was sort of grappling with my climate grief before coming into this film. But I think, just being given that time, which I look back on as being quite precious now, to be able to go into a studio up the road from where I live and sit there for 12 to 15 hours, really just sort of going into this zone of the music and feeling those very raw emotions that to me meant something very personal. Not to mention that my own father, who died of cancer a few years before, so there was that element too, feeding into it. That process of being allowed to grieve and allowed to kind of sit in that experience for a long time, for me, for quite a few months of in and out of the studio of these very intense moments. That was very cathartic, and coming out the other end, I feel I think it's a weird experience. I won't say I'm now I've got all this hope. I've just got a different sort of degree of strength that I don't think I had prior to going into it. So I think that's hopefully what people might get from watching it too.
Jen, does that question make any sense, or should I do a
sure.
reframe?
Absolutely, it makes sense. And actually, I had the privilege and honor of spending a couple of days with Glenn Albright as well, and filming with him. And actually, he, unfortunately, we had to cut sequences that didn't deal directly with our subject, but he was so strong and had so many wonderful things to say. That was a very difficult cut to make, but. Yeah, so I don't think it could have been called solastalgia, because that's just one element to me. Because, for me, the reason I wanted to call it the magnitude of all things is because that's really what we're talking about. And it's really difficult to even consider, right? And there are two parallel narratives. One is coming to terms with my sister's death and her coming to terms with her own death. But as humans, we are impermanent. And yes, we live in a death-denying culture. We also push our own mortality and the truth of our impermanence away. But it's natural that we die. Everyone dies. Our beloveds die. That's sort of natural. Wherein to be in this moment in time where, due to human activity, we are ending the world as we know it, that's an anomaly. I mean, one can say, and certainly I've heard and spoke and learned a great deal from Indigenous people in terms of colonization, and that also was similar in the sense that it was the end of the world as they knew it, and equally as catastrophic. But for most people who are not Indigenous and do not have that history, we have not ever encountered this before. And it is not natural. I mean, it's natural in the sense that humans are part of nature, and of course this is all tautological and we could dissect it to no end. But I'm going to go out on a limb and say this is not natural. For my children, and by the way, I don't, just because I have children, that's not why I care. I care deeply, obviously, about my children, but I care about all children, and I care about non-human animal children too. And I don't like that myopic perspective that we just want to protect the earth for our own children. But that my children, who I know so directly, have to grow up knowing that, and because I'm their mom, they especially know it well, sadly, that they have to come to terms with that reality is just so not natural. And so that's, I think that's all a long answer to why ultimately I settled on the magnitude of all things. The other title, there's a few other titles. One was Death Shines a Light. That was a title for a while. Another was The Air That Breathes Us. That was another title for a while. But anyway, there's not very many people know that.
That's great. I love getting those little nuggets, behind the scenes things. You also answered another question I was about to ask, and that is the cancer metaphor seems to be so universal now. I mean, like everyone knows someone who has either died from or luckily survived or is going through now cancer, and it seems to be just so relatable and so powerful, and we can understand as individuals that this level of grief is immense, and just can you not see why we shouldn't feel that level of grief about what's going on to the natural world? If you have this level of grief about a person, about a just implacable, horrific thing, what about this other implacable, horrific thing? But that metaphor, do you see any gaps or any problems with it for yourself personally when you're thinking about climate change? How well does the climate change is like cancer for the planet metaphor work for you?
If I reflect on my experience going through my dad passing away over a 4-month period with pancreatic cancer, that process was interesting for me because my dad had spent a lot of his life reading about death, being really interested in it and very spiritual about it. But getting towards the end, I think there was that moment of shifting from an intellectual to an emotional experience of it that many people in this point in time I feel that's happening to them in terms of climate change as well. So it's that shift from understanding it on a scientific level to shifting to, okay, this is what we're facing, and this is what it means for all the things that I love. And so you know, everyone has reactions to that, and I think it's a good metaphor because it's the same as the way it's that uncertainty. We think, you know, there's aspects of it that are terminal. There are aspects of it that we can fight for. And we got to balance the fighting for something versus the accepting of something as well. So it's a good metaphor, I think.
Yeah, well said. I think I agree with all of that, of course. I think Uncle Kevin Taggart says it in the film very well. You know, he himself even describes the open pit mining in his Wanarua country as, you know, it's a great big cancer eating away our country. It's interesting too, the whole thing around. There's a lot of cancers, as we know. I mean, it's very difficult to prove the source of a cancer. I think that's part of the problem in terms of eliminating some of the environmental chemicals that, say, cause cancer. But, you know, there is an element of some cancers which are also human-caused. And so I think there's that element as well. But ultimately, I think for me, where the analogy breaks down is what I was referencing before. And that is, you know, as human beings, we know we're impermanent. We know everybody around us is impermanent. And it's natural at some point to have to let go of either our own lives or those we love. And I think that, you know, what I have experienced with some people that are extremely close to me that have had cancer, including, of course, my sister, but also my Zen teacher. Right now, he has cancer. And for both my sister and my Zen teacher, and my Zen teacher is still with us and thriving and doing very well, but he relayed a story the other day about just this sublime moment that he had where he was just laughing hysterically and said out loud, "Oh, I wish everyone could have cancer," just in terms of the insight that it has given him, and the love of life, and the appreciation of every single moment. And my sister was similarly that way, in the sense that, you know, it's I mean, we all know we're going to die, but sometimes it takes a terminal diagnosis to really, really at the deepest level of our being know that. And then for many people, especially those who have done a lot of personal work in their lives, that brings out their best, right? And that almost transports them into this larger field of being that I think many of us crave to be in. And I've witnessed that with my sister and my Zen teacher, and their extraordinary feelings of interconnection with all life. I don't know if you experienced that with your dad, Rob. Anyway, sometimes there's these gifts, you know, a journey like facing a cancer diagnosis. And then there can be gifts related to facing the climate crisis, but I would really say they're different. And I say this in the film, you know, instead of like in terms of the climate crisis, I think what it's showing humanity is what we've missed if we had stopped looking forward and looked around, right? I think that it's really exposing the flaws of the modernity project, this idea that things are always going to get better and better and better, that humans are not one animal among many who all have the will to live, as Albert Schweitzer says, but rather, you know, we're on the top of this hierarchy and everything in this world is for us. So, you know, I think climate change really, like cancer can sort of, in its best, and I don't want to idealize this because obviously there's tremendous suffering that accompanies it, but cancer at its best can give us the gift of extreme presence, And I think climate change can do that, but it's got this tragic side to it, in the sense that it's really showing us, humanity, and in particular, those who are within the Western neoliberal world. But I'll go back farther and not only blame Western neoliberals. There's others to blame too. But our flaws, our deep flaws about, and our misconceptions of what we thought we were as humans. And there's a great deal of sadness, I find, and regret that comes from that awareness, in the sense that, wow, if only we had been able to see this earlier. Because I think maybe it's part of it is that it's too late to stop entirely. It's not too late to turn things around. In some ways, it's not too late to stop the most catastrophic of the predictions. But as we well know, climate catastrophe is baked into the system.
Yeah, we don't have to fall down the whole staircase, but we're down at least a few steps.
We are down, I would say, more than a few steps. But anyway, though, I hope that was clear. But for me, there's a lot of differences between facing cancer and facing climate change.
Can I just add? I mean, I think I liked what you said about it, bringing you into this sort of real presence, and that happened to me. I really experienced that through my dad's experience, and just being really, hyper aware of my senses like I'd never sort of been before. I was noticing wind in the leaves of the trees and how the light was coming into the room, and everything sort of slowed down, and it's sort of, a lot of that has stayed with me, I think, post that. And I think also it's a similar experience, I think, going through facing up to climate grief. You start to become much more observant about where you live and noticing all these things around you and the systems that are working around you as well. And that can feed into a sense of strength, because it can give you a renewed sense of love about, where you live and what you're a part of. And yeah, I guess as Jen mentioned, that has a big bag of loss that comes with it as well. But I think it's also a source of strength, or as you say in the film, a sense of rapture that you can get from that sort of mindset or attitude.
So many other questions I could ask. I was really hoping to use this opportunity to kind of put on a bit of a masterclass for filmmakers and composers, but not being a filmmaker, not a composer myself, I don't know exactly what messages they need to hear. So I guess I'm going to ask you a closing question after this next one, and that closing question will be, what advice would you give yourself as a filmmaker, at the start of your career, Jen, or 10 years ago, or, to someone who's just starting out? Like, we obviously need a lot more climate engaged film, but to kind of turn from the climate talk, how do they make the best film they can make that actually moves people's hearts and minds? And I've got another quick follow-up question I really want to ask before I get into the other stuff, which is, Seaspiracy on Netflix has, become quite controversial by making big claims, and most of them are right and a few of them are wrong, and it created a furor. You've got films like Dominion that have led to road takeovers by some, call them vegans, others call them, anti-animal cruelty advocates. It seems like a lot of films in this area measure their success or try to become successful by directly courting or stirring controversy. Magnitude doesn't do that. Why?
Well, I mean, as a filmmaker, I feel it's imperative to... Well, actually, it's interesting because your two questions in some ways are related to me. But, well, for one...
No, because they were a mess.
Okay, So, in terms of controversy, for me, I just make films about what I feel are the most pressing social, political, and environmental issues of the day. And at the root sort of motivation I have in all my films is to make the familiar strange. So I like to look at things that are socially constructed and expose their construction, because that ultimately means that we can reconstruct it. And so if you look at the two corporation films, they're very much there. And so while I can look at, the corporation films are, there's a lot of sort of facts in there, right? But absolutely imperative that we research and present only what we know to be true, because otherwise I just think you lose your credibility. And so, it's not my intention to stir up controversy for the sake of controversy. My intention is to, with Magnitude, it's really to share an authentic reflections about a very difficult moment in time and my grappling with this moment in time the best way I can. So I think maybe for me, Michael Moore is somebody that loves to stir up controversy and get attention that way. And it's just not my style, and it's not my motivation, and it's not very Canadian. I'm laughing because it's in North America it's very sort of American, not Canadian. It's maybe New Zealand and Australia has a similar dynamic. Anyway, I don't know. Did you want to answer the controversy question, Rob? Or
I don't know if it really applies to music and my role in this, but I think I think it's there is an element of controversy about this film in the sense that it is confronting something that people want to push away. So there's that controversy that I can imagine is there, and I think it's probably it'd be interesting, I think, to see how this film lands with people who aren't already engaged with it, and thinking about that spectrum of the 6 Americas or the 7 Americas, 6 Australias, whatever it is. How that falls down the line of The Alarmed and all those other categories. But I think there's, I think it's more subtle than those other films you mentioned.
Yeah, there's definitely that element that some filmmakers, they, like Michael Moore, they're making a film for a purpose. It's because of a social injustice that they see they want to correct, and so, being a bit of a showman and causing some controversy as a promotional vehicle for the film, they would justify it as, because I'm doing a stunt or I'm saying something that might be close to being fact-checkable, is going to result in more people seeing the film, therefore more social good, potentially.
I actually think it's wrong. I think it's the opposite. I think you need to be for example, Human Rights Watch just fact-checked the new corporation for us, and they had us in a panel in London, and they wouldn't profile our film until they fact-checked it. And I think that when you present Cowspiracy was another one, which wasn't completely authentic. There was some things in there that were just plain wrong, and I think you just really undermine your credibility. And for me,
I have to ask, how did you score?
Oh, we passed. We totally passed. Yeah. But my motivation is also correcting injustice. I just don't see the world. You see, I can't do it that way because I don't see the world in black and white. Right? For me, there's just these infinite shades of gray, and I can just go down every white to black saturation rabbit hole. So, I think that people that, some people just see the world black and white, and that works well in today's media landscape for a lot of people. But that's not the way I see the world, and I don't really appreciate media like that. I don't find it to be that respectful of the viewer. It can be manipulative. I loved The Octopus Teacher. That's a film I loved lately, is The Octopus Teacher. And I just found that to be so beautiful, such a beautiful poetic reflection of the relationship between humanity and the non-human world. And so subtle, and anyway, that's sort of more my style, as you can tell.
Absolutely. So I guess to make it kind of tangible for the potential filmmaker or composer out there is do you find yourself composing music for the villain in the film? Is this the point of the film where the head of the NRA is going to come out and you're going to grab the clip of him and, Rob, it's your job to put something dark and ominous under this guy, to show just how villainous he is. That is lacking in Magnitude. It is a collection of people all coming to terms with something horrific and inexorable, and that's what it is.
What Magnitude's taught me maybe about composing is that just sort of trusting your own, experience of something and being allowed to kind of go into the music in a way where you're just sort of pausing a lot of the other insecurities or intellectual concerns you might have about making music for a film, because I think that can be quite big for composers, is that this sort of comparison with others, or comparison with the industry, and thinking about things in a musical way, and it can kind of really get in the way of actually just accessing that part of yourself that you want to be able to access to make music. And that's really hard to get to, but I think doing this film was such a great opportunity for me because it was so nicely dovetailing these two areas of my life together. But I think I've been listening to a lot of David Whyte, the Irish poet, who I think lives in your part of the world, Jen, and he's written a really nice essay called Close, and it's about always being close to something, being close to being done, being close to happiness, being close to, and I think it's a nice sort of thing to reflect on when you're making art like this, is that you can get sort of caught up in trying to make something perfect, or sort of being, I think as a composer more broadly, this is really good ethic to have, is just to do stuff, get things out there, and not be too worried about every little detail in that piece of music. So that's just the way that I operate, and my advice, but I've never listened to anyone else's advice, so don't take mine.
And on that note, let's give some advice. So, but genuinely, people are going to watch this film, people who want to be filmmakers, who want to be composers, and this film is going to inspire them. And this might be the reason that they decide to make a film about the climate crisis than about another topic. And I'm sorry it's overly broad. I'm sorry for you and being asked this question. I'm sorry for them. I can't give them the space to, learn something more specific. But, maybe for your, if you were starting over your career with knowing what's going on in the world now, like, how would you get going in this space to hopefully do something productive and constructive about climate change in this art?
Yes, that is a hard question, and I hope this is in some ways satisfying. I'm not sure it will be, but like for myself, for example, with The Magnitude of All Things, pitching this film about climate change and cancer, it was like, are you kidding me? and because it's different for writing a book. Like, books can be depressing, and there's no pressure to have a book that's hopeful. But a documentary film especially, is supposed to be hopeful. So I think what I would just say is, don't just very Joseph Campbell, just follow your bliss. Trust yourself, and what story do you want to tell more than anything? And you have to have, well, I'll tell you one little anecdote. When I was making my first feature documentary, A Cow at My Table, and that took me 5 years, and I emerged from that film less than 100 pounds. I'm not a huge person anyway, but that's very skinny for me because, I worked so hard. I was hardly eating. It was at early days of nonlinear systems, and it took forever to render just the smallest thing. But I would literally say, once this film is released, I could die, because my life would have meant something. Now, I didn't want to die. I was being a little hyperbolic, I'll admit. But I do think you have to have that level of commitment, because it is very hard on so many levels, just in terms of all of the hurdles that you're going to run up against. So you have to have that belief and that commitment and that urge to tell this story, to correct this injustice, to get the truth out, to urge viewers to reflect deeply, to inspire viewers to be everything they can be. You have to have that desire to make it, I think. So I think that's what I would say is just trust yourself and go deeply within and discover the story you want to tell. More than anything, that you will feel, once it's told, your life has been worthwhile. So there you go. That's sounding very grandiose, I think, but I really do feel like you have to have that level of determination.
What your show is sort of all about as well is there's real pressing need for artists to be engaging in this space, just because it accesses many, so many different aspects of ourselves in trying to confront what we face, compared to, we've had many years of trying to do it through science and through other forms of communication, but to really have these lasting impacts. And I like the octopus teacher as an example from Jen, because it's that style where something can have that, real subtle but longer lasting impact than, say, something that rouses you up and fires you up into hitting the streets. I think that's a short-term hit, really, compared to these more deeper emotional changes that can happen from being, experiencing someone that's really poured everything into making climate engaged art. So, yeah, I would highly recommend getting into it.
Yeah, and actually, I'll just point to the book, The Great Derangement by Amitav Ghosh, which is it's a small little book. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it speaks about literature. And really, he is asking the question, like, given what's happening in the world, why is not every piece of literature in some ways addressing this subject? And I think that is given just the magnitude again, of this crisis, it's sort of a little bit perplexing. Why not every piece of art, or not every film or every book, even, and of course it can be in an intersectional way with other issues, like, why are not more people grappling with these issues and reflecting on them in the work that they're creating? Because it's really just a tiny fragment of what's being created.
Yeah, I just think that's a good point. The intersectional aspects of it are really important. So it's not just, tackling it head on. It's all the ways in which it is embedded through all these other things, and teasing that out and bringing that to light.
Can I ask a potentially prickly question or thorny question? It's not intended to be, but in the middle of making Magnitude, you made the sequel to New Corporation. Did New Corporation speak to the climate crisis as, as a symptom of our economic model?
Absolutely, yes. Yes.
Wonderful.
And it also did the same with COVID. Yes, mm-hmm. Yes, that was absolutely vital and important that we did that.
You've both been so wonderful. I'm going to have a nice outro summary to wrap it all up at the end, which I'll record after going over the tape and sort of assembling a 30, 40-minute episode out of this very, very generous hour and 20 minutes you've given me. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. It was really, really nice to speak. And it was so great to see you again, Rob.
Yeah, you too, Jen.
And here we are, together at the outro. Just so you know, to break this fourth wall, I'm recording this outro now before I go back and record the intro to this episode. So when you hear this, know that I'm about to go back and record the intro in just a second, and I will be working out as I go what I'm about to say. Having just listened back to the entire recording, going from an hour and 20 minutes down to the hour, know that I have such respect for what Jen does as an editor, going from 400 hours of tape down to a feature-length documentary. It's a skill set that I'm sure takes a long time to build, and it's a muscle that, once developed, is very valuable, because it is hard to develop. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I hope that the poignant moments about talking about cancer as a metaphor for climate change, and talking about grief and climate change, and talking about how we can make compelling media about climate was of interest and of value potentially to you. I hope if you're listening to this as a potential budding filmmaker or composer, that you take something from this and you take it and you run with it, and that I'm talking to you one day if I'm lucky. This was great to do. I just want to thank Rob and Jen so much for this. Rob for setting this all up. It was Rob who reached out to me to ask me if I wanted to do this, and yeah, I really, really did. I think this was easily the best chat that I've ever been a part of in this space, and I'm really humbled by getting to do it. I can't wait to bring you a art breaker version of this episode where I trim it down from this hour down to 30 or 40 minutes, coupled with some of Rob's amazing music from the film, coupled with some more clips from the film. That's going to be really, really, really special. And if you have any skills in the editing department, or if you'd like to be part of that process, please do just drop me a line at hello@climactic.fm. But until then, until we release that episode, look out for any chance you might get to see The Magnitude of All Things. I can't recommend highly enough that you go out and see it, or potentially stay in and see it, if that's the option. Whatever way in which you can see it, see it. This is truly the first kind of cinematic experience we've had in the climate space, and sure, there is amazing shots in Before the Flood, the Leonardo DiCaprio documentary, but this is another breed. This is something else. So thank you again to Jen and to Rob, and until next time, take care of each other and stay safe in these climactic times. The Climactic Collective.